So to tell you a little bit about Michael Deagler, his debut novel, which is absolutely wonderful, is called Early Sobrieties. And it was a New York Times editor book of choice. Deagler's fiction has appeared in numerous journals, including Harper's, McSweeney's Quarterly Concern, Electric Literature's Recommended Reading, and elsewhere. He is the recipient of a National Magazine Award, as well as fellowships from the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, Massachusetts, and the Kimmel Harding Nelson Center for the Arts. He lives in Los Angeles right now, where he, too, is a student. He is part of a PhD program in creative writing and literature at USC. So I'm going to read this off my phone. I've never done this before. Michael Deagler's, I was corrected on that. It's Michael Deagler's book, has been praised as a debut of, quote, enormous promise from Kirkus Reviews. And the New York Times said it was, quote, a comic meditation on the impossibility of imposing narrative structure on our lives. It was that idea from the article, this impossibility of imposing structure on our lives, that really grabbed me. Because in the book, the main character, Dennis Monk, is moving from house to house, couch surfing, living in spare bedrooms and in basements after his parents have kicked him out. He's in the early stages of recovery from a years-long alcohol addiction. And he's at this transitional time in his life where everything really is sort of in flux. This results in him going on ridiculous, dangerous adventures where, for example, he is the sober driver in an attempt to score some meth, with an acquaintance. And then he's also experiencing the heartache of seeing the girlfriend he still loves but is no longer with. The novel seems to be not only about recovery, which it explores beautifully, but also about being at a place in life when there are choices to be made of what a person is going to carry forward from their past and what they're going to have to leave behind and what they're going to make totally new. And the book explores not only the struggles of recovery and of being in that transitional space, but also the excitement and even sometimes the joy of seeing the world in a new way that feels maybe like a gift, that feels like a chance, not to change the past, but to create and walk into one's wholly new future. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce Michael Deagler.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Suzanne, for that amazing introduction. And I'm very happy to participate in any way in raising awareness of the Wellness Center, which sounds really great. I'm 11 years sober, but it was certainly a thing I struggled with when I was in college, and so I'm glad that there are resources for people who need them. I would certainly advocate taking advantage of. The earlier the better, honestly, when dealing with addiction and stuff. But yeah, it's great to be here. I grew up outside of Philadelphia. I live in New York, or I live in Los Angeles now. New Jersey kind of holds a specific place in my writing life, though, because I got my master's at Rutgers Camden. And then the first place I ever taught fiction, I taught a continuing education fiction workshop for a couple of semesters at Rowan College, Burlington County, RCBC, which is another fine community college of the Garden State. So I'm gonna read. As Suzanne said, there's a book about. This guy, Dennis Monk. He's 26. He's recently sober, and the book kind of follows him through his first year of sobriety, as he's kind of staying with different people. And I'm gonna read a chapter that I started reading we had like a nice little dinner with some of the students before. So all you need to know for this is he's 6 or 7 months sober. He was staying with his parents in the suburbs, and they kicked him out, so now he's staying with a friend of his in South Philadelphia. It's called Pat's Geno's. That summer, someone decided to erect pop-up beer gardens in the unused lots throughout the city, which offended me in a way that I found difficult to articulate. They were affected, trendy places with trendy beers for trendy people. Not my scene, even if I'd still had a scene. There was one in the lot across from Pat's King of Steaks, beneath a crumbling mural of Frankie Avalon and Fabian and some other teen idols from the early 60s. I was sitting at one of Pat's picnic tables with my friend Boris Spang, and those teen idols were staring at me right in the face. At some point, everybody had moved to South Philadelphia. I suspected it was initially a practical decision. It was a reasonably priced section of the city with neighborhoods that were more or less intact. There were bakeries, bars, sandwich shops. The row houses were quaint in a pre-war proletariat sort of way, with garlands of Christmas lights strung between them all 12 months of the year. Once the first hipsters planted their flag, South Philadelphia became a cool place to live, particularly east of Broad in the old Italian wards. But I don't have to explain to you how gentrification works. My retreat to my parents' house, out among the cornfields and subdivisions of Bucks County, had lasted a little over 6 months. My mother tolerated me until she didn't. My sobriety was not something she was obligated to foster like the orchid of some out-of-town neighbor. Owen found an apartment down the road. That's his brother, Owen. Owen found an apartment down the road, but I decided to come back to the city. I tried to return to Kensington, only to realize I no longer knew anyone in Kensington, or Fishtown, or Northern Liberties. They had migrated en masse to South Philadelphia. I followed. What else could I do? I was sleeping on Bors's couch, washing dishes 3 nights a week at a banquet hall in Pennsport, spending my free time rereading Patricia Highsmith novels and sipping water in bars. Bors was manhandling a whiz with onions as he told me a story from a time he'd worked a construction job out toward the middle of the state. Lancaster County, near all the Amish, right? So I was eating by myself in this little roadside diner when I was propositioned by an Amish man. He offered me $2,000 if I would be willing to impregnate his daughter. Oh, yeah? I wasn't eating anything. The evening was too hot. South Philadelphia always felt hot to me. That June was subtropical. The whole district went sleeveless. We sweated as a body politic, indoors and out. Yet for some reason the food was all tamales and faux gras and jardinera relishes, burgers topped with sriracha and long hots, cheesesteaks the size of dachshunds, jalapeno-flavored craft beers that even I thought sounded disgusting, though I still wanted them badly. It was too much. I would have been happy with cigarettes and coffee, that duo of vices still available to me. But it was too hot for them as well. I was a man at odds with his surroundings. I was perhaps less bubbly than my usual self. And why would he do that? See, the Amish have been intermarrying for generations, explained Bors. They're all cousins at this point. They need to expand the gene pool or their kids will turn weird. So these Amish fathers go out scouting for studs. Why wouldn't they just go to a sperm bank, I asked. It was a poor question given the context of the story, but I was playing a very passive role in the conversation. Bors blinked at me like I was an idiot. They're Amish. They do everything the old-fashioned way, which means I'd have to deliver the goods in person, like with my dick. Bors wore a thick blonde beard that would have made a Viking proud. His was just the sort of look likely to impress a man attempting to breed a new generation of barn raisers and buggy drivers. I shrugged. So you said no? Of course I did, Monk. Who do you think I am? Forget even for a moment issues of consent. Can you imagine trying to have sex with a farm girl in a bonnet while her kinfolk are standing on the other side of the door, waiting to pitchfork me in the spine if they hear a noise they don't like? Bors grabbed a wad of napkins and scrubs them around the periphery of his mouth. The whole thing is a huge turnoff. We were at Pat's King of Steaks because Boers was a Pat's man, if only as a vote against its competitor Gino's, which rose before us like a neon casino catacorner across Passyunk Avenue. Boers refused to eat at Gino's because of the sign at the counter, "This is America," when ordering speak English. Gino's founder, Joey Vento, was a love-it-or-leave-it type who, after years of serving steak sandwiches to the people of Passyunk Square, had looked around one day and decided that the neighborhood had gotten a bit too Mexican. Of course, observant patrons might have guessed Vento's politics even before he hung up the sign. There was a photo under the restaurant's awning of him sitting astride a monstrous motorcycle with a stars and bars bandana tied atop his walnut of a head, grinning like he truly believed his 5'0" paisano frame would have received a warm welcome in the Confederate States of America. Joey Vento had died a few years back, but the sign remained. At some point in my life, I had been a Gino's man. At some other point, I had been a Pat's man. At various times, if a person had asked me Pat's or Gino's, I would have replied Jim's or Tony Luke's, like a smartass. Later, I would have said something about the illusion of choice and worked it into some discussion of late capitalism or the American party system or existentialist literature. I was, at times, a bit insufferable. But all that was in the past. Now I was a cheesesteak Ronin, masterless and unaffiliated. Because at the end of the day, who really gave a fuck? Satiated, Boers turned sideways from the table and stretched his legs, bare below his cut-off jean shorts, out into the thoroughfare. I noticed there was a bandage taped over a section of his left calf. "Get clipped with a nail gun?" I asked. Boers glanced down at his leg. "Nah, new tattoo, bro." "Didn't you already have something there?" I couldn't remember what it was. "What was it before?" Boers grinned and shook his head. "What would be the point of getting it covered up if I went around reminding everybody of what it used to be?" I figured it had to have been some emo lyric, something too angsty and teenage for the man Boers had settled into. "What did you cover it with?" "Flyers logo." Boers stood, collecting the detritus of his meal. "I think we ought to take this show across the street, Monk. Have some drinks out under the stars." There were no stars to be seen. In the haze of city summer, the night sky wasn't all that much darker than its daytime equivalent, though it came in a wider assortment of colors: reds, purples, oranges, browns. That particular night, it had turned sulfuric gray, like a boiled egg yolk oxidizing in the open air. Even so, it was preferable to a ceiling, and the beer garden was already filled with dozens of people drinking in the twilight, laid-back youngsters with disposable incomes lounging happily on benches and in Adirondack chairs, chatting with their bearded boyfriends, their nose-ringed girlfriends, tattoos and plaid, ciders and wheat beers. Why did I hate them? Demographically, they were my people. But as an individual, no, I was not one of them, because I was not bearded or nose-ringed or tattooed, and because I couldn't afford to live anywhere without somebody doing me a favor, and because I couldn't drink ciders or wheat beers or stouts or whiskeys or novelty jalapeno-flavored ales, couldn't luxuriate in the bonhomie of unaddicted summer. But I didn't hate them. I was done hating other people. We were standing at the outdoor bar for a whole minute before I realized that its tender was an ex-girlfriend of Boers's, one of the more significant ones. Lila Noth looked spent. Fatigue shadowed her back and forth across the bar as she filled plastic pint glasses with cloudy Hefeweizen. She was short, with inky black hair, and had that vaguely ageless quality that a server's uniform and cigarettes and years of working nights gives a person, which is attractive, I think, at least to the sort of people that find city life attractive. "What do you want?" she said to Boers. She looked less than pleased to see him. "What have you got in the way of a dunkel?" asked Boers. He planted his elbow on the bar, his chin in his palm, and looked at Lila as though she were an object of great curiosity. Lila ignored him. "Dennis Monk?" "Just water, thanks." "Monk quit drinking," said Boers, 6 months ago. 7 months ago, I said. Lila placed a cup of ice water in front of me. She reacted to my words with what might have been the faintest bit of surprise, or feigned surprise. Did you? Good for you. Anything malty really would be fine, said Bors. I saw Kathy Tomlinson the other day, said Lila. Kathy Tomlinson was a woman I was with for a while, before, one of the more significant ones. Around here? I asked. I thought she moved to Seattle. Lila shook her head. She lives on 13th, right on Columbus Square. Nice house. Oh, yeah? That was not far from where we stood, a quick walk. What's her situation? I think she's working for some nonprofit. We didn't talk long. She's living with her fiancé, if that's what you're asking. You know, what the hell, dealer's choice, said Bors. I'll take anything with alcohol. Some of us haven't quit yet. Lila gave Bors a look of revulsion that only years of intimacy could foster. I took my cup of water and excused myself. I found one of a trio of unoccupied chairs set around a patio table and sat staring up at the deteriorating portrait of Bobby Rydell. The surface of the mural had eroded in several places, including most of Rydell's torso, exposing the underlying bricks of the house on which it was painted. At the next table, I could hear a young couple telling their friends about their recent forays into home ownership, how they had purchased a little row house on Manton Street and were restoring it themselves, putting in the hours on nights and weekends, while she did something at Jefferson Hospital and he was an accountant for the school district. It was labor-intensive, but it made them feel as though they were earning the right to live there, said he, and that it was an emotional investment in the neighborhood, said she. Their friends lauded their passionate industry. A benefit of sobriety was that I felt superior toward anyone who drank, regardless of the other factors of their lives or mine. An unflattering quality, for sure, but an indispensable one, particularly if you don't have much else going on. I sipped my ice water. It was cold enough to hurt my teeth. I was jealous of everybody for everything. I was jealous of the Manton Street couple for their house, their jobs, their drinks, one another. I was jealous of Bors for his vocational skills, his apartment, his lucrative fecundity. I was jealous of Lila for her lived-in life, her thick-skinned competence. I'd been under the impression that I'd been building up calluses during my 8 years of ceaseless boozing. But upon ripping away my whiskey bandage, I found that there was only new red skin beneath it. I was raw as an infant. From my seat, I could see Gino's shining like a carnival ride on its slice of pavement. Xenophobia notwithstanding, I sympathized with dead Joey Vento. I, too, was afraid of change. And who wasn't? My fear, precisely, was of the times passing me by. I had no real misgivings concerning the gentrification of South Philadelphia. I just didn't want to be left out of it. My peers were raising up their futures like the Amish with their barns, while I was still out on the road like a tramp, alone and less than whole. I didn't want everyone to be all right until I was all right. I knew it was selfish, but that's how I felt. Self-awareness for me was recent, revelatory, and bleak. Bors walked up, chugging something amber from a plastic cup. Come on, she's being a bitch. We were up the block at the birthday bar, where decades of drunken embellishments had plastered the walls with photographs of native sons even more obscure than those on the beer garden mural. Joe Valino, Sonny Averona, Dom Irera. It was a cramped, muggy place, one that still allowed smoking, and though the fumes were already thick enough to give me a nicotine contact high, I lit a cigarette for myself. I could never resist the opportunity to smoke indoors. The special was a Yingling Premium can and a shot of Windsor Canadian. Bors got to work pouring them into himself. With every round, he ordered me a water, a gesture I appreciated, though I hardly needed so many. The accumulation of half-empty cups made it look like I was preparing a glass harp performance. We sat jammed in at a communal table in the corner, elbow to sweaty elbow with people not so different than those in the beer garden, though these variants smoked and laughed and drank like they knew something, and yelled over the new wave being piped at us through unseen speakers. I'd called Bors when I first got back to the city because I knew he wouldn't mind me crashing on his couch for a while. I had a handful of other people I could call, and I figured I'd have to call all of them before the summer was over. It would take a while to get something permanent together. I didn't want to put anyone out for too long, but Bors, at least, was hard to put out. There was a disciplined equanimity about him. Even at his most publicly intoxicated, he rarely got worked up over anything. and yet he was clearly bothered by the encounter with Lila. I was working with these Guatemalans a few years back, he said, installing a pool up in Quakertown. Illegal guys. They offered to sell me their sister, like to be my wife, for $8,000. $8,000, I whistled. You'd need to impregnate like 4 Amish women to afford that. Yeah, I don't know what their angle was. He was starting to sound drunk. You would think, like, if I married her, she'd get a green card, and she could stay in the country. So shouldn't they be paying me? I told them that, and they were like, no, she cooks, she cleans. And I'm like, I could find a wife for free, guys. If I wanted one, I don't need to pay $8,000. It just kind of seemed like a slavery situation, you know? You really have an ear to the sexual black market, I said. I never get solicited for these kinds of transactions. That's because you look like such a grouch. You should try smiling sometimes. Boers flashed his teeth to demonstrate. Did you hear Lila said Kathy Tomlinson was back in town? I asked him. Did you know about that? Boers's gaze fixated on the woman seated beside him at the other end of our table. She was engaged in an animated conversation with a friend, but I couldn't make out its theme. She wore a T-shirt bearing the likeness of Flyers enforcer Dave the Hammer Schultz, and I realized that was what had caught Boer's attention. Excuse me, he said to her. Excuse me. He repeated it until the woman acknowledged that she was being addressed. When she turned to look at him, Boers lurched up onto his unsteady feet. Check this shit out, he said, or rather shouted, and brought his left shoe up onto the table, wobbling as he balanced on his right leg. His calf was exposed, the one with the new tattoo. He ripped the bandage from it in one swift motion. I imagined I could hear a tearing sound over the music. Beneath it lay a wound of red and black and orange, a Flyers logo stamped onto the shaved pink skin of Boers's calf. Inflamed and lacquered with ointment, it seemed like the eye of Horus. Right? He said to the girl, but she turned her face in disgust. Right? She and her friend decamped to a different corner of the room. Hey, come on, Boers called after them. He took his foot off the table and slumped back down. He finished his Yingling slowly, like he didn't recognize the taste, like the bartender had given him something he hadn't asked for. I think I'm done with this city, he said after a minute. I'm going to go to Idaho. I told you I was out there last summer for lineman training. I left early. Shouldn't have left, man. What's out there? I asked. Hills. He closed his eyes. I stamped out my cigarette. I couldn't sit there anymore. I'm going to head out. I'll see you back at the apartment. Boers smiled, his eyes still shut. Sure thing, Monk. I'll be camped right here for a while. Outside, the night clung to the rooftops, ogling pedestrians as they shuffled their way from house to bar or bar to house. The light and noise of the city, the glaring, the clanking, was a comfort to me. Back in Bucks County, the night was black and still and silent. It reminded me of the emptiness of space, the interminability of the cosmos. City night just reminded me of egg rolls and burnt coffee and misdemeanors, of all the things I didn't need but could procure with little effort, distractions to carry me through the hours until the sun came up. Dawn always felt like a victory, one that I could celebrate with sleep. The sun setting and rising provided me with a sense of progress, though I had made none to brag about. My primary achievement of the previous 7 months was racking up days, like a prisoner etching X's on a cell wall. My primary achievement of the 8 years before that was disappointing everyone I knew. Or no, that wasn't quite it. What I'd done was spend 8 years lowering people's expectations of me to the point where they could no longer be disappointed. People gradually ceased to take an interest in my life until they had no reason left to think of me. The dead lived on in the memory of the living, but there were plenty of living people who no one else ever thought about. 3-story row houses dozed all down the 1300 block of 13th Street, their upper windows thrown wide to catch whatever breezes might be blowing west from Camden. An obliging breeze would have far to travel, high across the swollen Delaware, across the piers and roofs of Pennsport, and through the swishing trees of Columbus Square. It would probably blow itself out before it got there. The block was quiet. It was close to midnight, a Tuesday. There was no way to know which house was Kathy's, so I walked down the street until I found one that struck me. It had shutters on the windows and a freshly painted blue door, with gardening pots lined up before it on the pavement, and planted near the curb, a snowdrop tree. I knew it was a snowdrop tree because there was a little sign stuck in between the flagstones that identified it as such. It was a young tree, thin-trunked, 15 feet high, but it wasn't difficult to picture it growing large enough to shade the whole front of the house in the sweltering summers to come. It was a suitable house, the kind I could have imagined for Kathy, the kind I could have imagined for both of us at some earlier point in time, if I had ever thought to imagine it. She answered after a few rings. Her voice was dense and low in a way that suggested she'd recently been asleep. "Dennis?" "Kathy," I said. "This might sound strange, but I think I'm outside your house." "What?" "You're on 13th Street, right? Across from the park? Look outside." I stared up at the open windows on the second and third floors of the Snowdrop house, waiting for Kathy's face to appear at one of them. They remained empty in the hot night, like a series of abstract canvases painted one unvarying shade of black. "I don't see you," came her voice over the phone. "Are you fucking with me?" "No, I'm out here. Wait a second." I backed into the street and scanned the windows up and down the block. I saw a face peering cautiously out of the second floor of a house 5 or 6 doors up the row. I'd picked the wrong address. Guessing was never a strength of mine. "Here I am," I said, walking up, waving. She offered a timid flutter of fingers. In the dark, I had trouble making out her features. Her hair was shorter than it had been. Her neck looked longer. But the way she held her phone to her ear was familiar somehow. The way her elbow cut in toward the center of her chest. She leaned against the window frame. We regarded each other for the first time in a long time. Wow. She was still speaking into the phone. She wasn't going to shout down to me. The whole block could probably hear our conversation as it was. "There you are." "Come downstairs," I said. "I'm not coming down." "What are you doing here?" I didn't have an answer for that. "How are you?" "You're drunk." "No. Be honest." "I am. I quit." I'd wanted to tell her since it had first been true. 7 months sober, I kicked it. "Are you sure?" I'd lied about kicking it before. "What's that supposed to mean?" I tried to get a read on her reaction to my visit. She didn't appear to be smiling, but it was difficult to tell. She hung back, concealed in the shadow of her room. "Dennis, we haven't talked in 2 years, and you just showed up outside my apartment in the middle of the night. That's not exactly sober behavior." I was growing self-conscious there in the dim light of the lampposts. I had unwittingly placed myself on display before all the denizens of 13th Street. "I heard you lived here, from Lila Noth." She cleared her throat. "And so what, you've come to apologize?" No, I'm not in a program. I quit on my own. This isn't an apology." She laughed. "Of course." "Look, I've got a clean slate, you know." I spread my arms wide to show how free I was. "The way I was, that's over. Gone. It feels great." "Well, that's pretty convenient, isn't it?" "What do you mean?" "You just decided that you're absolved?" Her voice was rising, but she checked it, found her steadiness again. "Look, I'm happy for you. I've always wanted you to get to a good place." I really wished I could see her face in the light. If we were just face to face, if she could just see the clarity in my eyes, I knew she would understand that I had changed. "Come downstairs." "We're not just going to be friends, Dennis." She was almost whispering into the phone. "The way you were, that hasn't gone away, not for me." I stared up at her, but I couldn't think of anything else to say. I hadn't anticipated how easy it would be for her to rebuff me. We'd been very in love at one point. I heard a man's voice in the background, groggy and interrogative. "I have to go," said Kathy. She pulled her head back into the house, and the line went dead. I stood in the middle of 13th Street and felt the eyes, real or imagined, of a block's worth of noisy, judgmental people peering out at me through open windows. I crossed the sidewalk and started to leave, slowly at first, and then quickly. Before she left me, I remember Kathy complaining that I was motivated by hate instead of love. I think she meant it in the carrot and stick sense, the honey and vinegar sense, like how I didn't try to quit drinking when I loved somebody, how I only did it later when I hated myself. Most of the motivation for getting sober came from the belief that it would immediately solve the bulk of my problems: depression, anxiety, indigence, loneliness, obesity, the bruxism that ground away my tooth enamel every night when I passed out. It was true that each of those things decreased in severity once I stopped getting sloshed, but none of them fully disappeared. I wasn't reborn as a 17-year-old with a decade's worth of unblown opportunities lined up before me like freshly wrapped Christmas presents. I was still 26, still broke. My old flames had moved on. My tooth enamel did not grow back. I wondered, had I known all this, if I'd have been able to make it through the early days, if I'd have still thought it was worth it. I was wandering back toward the birthday bar when I spotted Lila Noth loitering in the golden light beneath the Geno's awning. She was smoking a cigarette and seemed to consider her own long shadow as it stretched before her across Passyunk Avenue. She might have been the subject of an Edward Hopper knockoff, preoccupied and elegantly alone. She spotted me approaching from half a block away, and she watched me until we were standing next to each other, as if we'd agreed to meet at that exact time and spot in front of the Geno's board of police department patches from across the country. "He's not still around, is he?" asked Lila. "Boers? I think he's at the birthday bar." "Your friend's a real asshole, you know that?" "I guess he is, yeah. I tended to think that people are many-splendored, but that was usually a useless point to make." Lila gave me a quick once-over. "What happened to you?" "Oh, who knows? I was beginning to feel like an idiot. You said Kathy Tomlinson lived on 13th, so I went over there to reconcile, and now I'm back here." Lila's eyebrows crept upward. So did the corners of her mouth. "It's kind of late at night for that, don't you think?" I nodded slowly. "Well, I do regretful shit all the time." She stamped out her cigarette and stepped under the heat lamp glow of the awning lights. "I'm getting a steak." "Are you a Geno's girl?" I wouldn't have picked her for one, but it was a hard thing to guess about a person. "Duh," she said. "My dad used to take us here when we were kids. The sign doesn't bother you?" Lila swatted the idea away with a flick of her hand. "You expect these third-generation cheesesteak jamokes to take orders in Spanish? They barely speak English." She bought her sandwich, and we sat at an empty picnic table. As she tore into the steak with her teeth, globs of cheese and onions dripped from the roll's crevice and pattered against the wrapper. She nodded at it, offering me a bite, but I shook my head. I wasn't in the mood for anything. "So how's the not drinking?" she asked between mouthfuls. That was just what I wanted, for someone to ask that exact question, if only as an acknowledgement of my Herculean task, how exacting it must be on my emotional state. I'd been preemptively composing an answer. "I feel like I've spent the last 8 years on a cruise ship," I said. Like, it was awful and gross and expensive, but I was drunk, so it didn't matter. And the whole time I was just throwing things off the side that I didn't think I needed. Life jackets, suitcases, deck chairs, just hurling it all over the railing. Then in a moment of, I don't know, insanity, I jumped off the back of the boat, jumped right into the ocean. The shock of the water cleared my head, and that felt good for a minute. But now I'm just treading along in the wake of the cruise ship. And I'm starting to get tired. And all I can do is grab onto the things I dropped overboard, the deck chairs and suitcases, just to keep myself from sinking. Hearing it out loud, the analogy sounded less profound. "I've never been on a cruise ship," said Lila. "I haven't either," I admitted. "My dad quit drinking, though, a couple of times." "Yeah?" I'd found that the children of alcoholics tended not to be as sympathetic toward alcoholics as you might assume. "What's his current status?" "Dead," said Lila, her mouth filled with steak. Ah. I tried to remember if I'd known that about Lila. I thought that I had encountered her father once at a restaurant, but maybe he had been a stepfather. "I'm sorry to hear that. How long has it been?" "Last week. Last Friday. Your father just died? Shit. I reviewed the night's events to include this new information. Does Boers know that? He knows, says Lila. Wow. Damn. I don't know what to say. She shrugged, chewed. Yeah, well. We don't have to talk about it, I said. How did he die? Lila rested her sandwich on its wrapper. She picked up a napkin and balled it thoughtfully between her palms. He quit drinking again, and his body chemistry got out of whack or something from the withdrawal, and his heart stopped. Last Friday, they think. He was living in this shithole in Norristown, and there was nobody around to help him. The mailman found him Saturday. Wait, you can die from withdrawal? I asked. Yeah, dude, delirium tremens. How do you not know that? I don't know. Who tells you that? If I'd known it might have killed me, there was no way I would have quit. Lila nodded solemnly. That's how Modest Magorski died. Who the hell is Modest Magorski? I tried to remember how I had felt my first week sober. I felt like shit, but I always felt like shit. I'd felt like shit every day for years and didn't even realize it. In my second week, I'd realized what it was to not feel like shit. Health became its own inebriation. I would just lie in the sun on my parents' lawn, unpained. A composer, said Lila. But if it's going to happen, it happens like 2 days after you quit. You said you've been sober for 6 months? 7, I said. I breathed the scent of fried onions deeply through my nostrils, detained it in my lungs. Jesus. Fuck, Lila, that's awful about your dad. It is what it is. She sounded tired of the whole thing. I mean, if he had kept drinking, it would have just been a heart attack or a stroke or something. This year, or the next one, or the one after. He wore out his body and it caught up with him. She stared down at her steak, like it had spoken to her, and then let out a sharp, heart-halting sob. It was so loud that I glanced around despite myself to see if anyone was watching. But that was as far as lamentations. She grabbed the wad of napkins and raised them to her nose. She sniffled. We sat in silence while she took another tiny bite of the sandwich. She set it down on the wrapper and pushed it away. You sure you don't want any? Her voice was even, as if the outburst hadn't occurred. I'm not going to eat it. Save it. I meant it to sound encouraging. What are you, new? These things don't keep for shit. They're inedible after 45 minutes. She got up and dropped the bundle with a thud into a garbage can. She lit a cigarette and cast meditative glances up and down the block. I figured it might be best to push the conversation away from death and its related topics. So where are you staying now? Titan Street. She nodded in the direction of the river. She brushed a strand of hair from her eyes. You want to see it? I watched her face to tell if she was asking what I thought she was asking. She exhaled her smoke at me, cloaked me in burned air. Yeah, I said, of course I would. Her room was in the back of a first-floor apartment. The heat of the day had not yet dissipated, and the air in the place was stickier than the air outside. Lila switched on an oscillating fan and lay on the bed in the dark. I crawled next to her and kissed her mouth. She smelled like sweat and beer and grease, nicotine and synthetic lilac. I didn't want a world that smelled any other way. I peeled off my T-shirt. I lifted my hand to her breast. She removed it, pressed back on my chest with the lightest touch. I changed my mind, she said. Huh? Sorry, my head's in a weird place. She reached for a lamp on the table and startled the room with light. It exposed me, sweaty and underdressed. Yeah, no problem. I tried to project indifference. I wished I hadn't taken off my shirt. I retrieved it from where I had tossed it on the floor and hung it over my shoulder. I was horrendously sweaty somehow. The room was suffocating, equatorial. I stuck my face up against the oscillating fan and sat like a Rodin nude, skin glinting in the light. You're hogging that, said Lila. I pressed the knob so that the fan blew its breath across her. She lay on her back with her eyes closed like she was contemplating sleep. It struck me as too intimate to pose for me to see her in. She reached again to the bedside table. Do you smoke weed or is that out of bounds? I shook my head. She pulled a 10-inch green bong from behind the lamp. I'm going to smoke. You can bounce if you want. This place gets pretty baked out. Okay, yeah. I fumbled back into my shirt, wishing I had just gone back to Bors's apartment, or stayed at the birthday bar, or done any number of things differently, which might have spared me the humiliation of that and other nights. I paused in her doorway. "Well, congratulations," she said. "For what?" "For not being Modest Magorsky," she said, toasting me with her bong. It reminded me of the kitschy glassware people use for tropical cocktails. "You lived, I mean. Nice job." I hurried out of the apartment, jerking at my t-shirt collar to pump air down my chest. On the street, I felt immediately hungry. Hungry like I hadn't felt in weeks, not since before I'd come to South Philadelphia. I walked west until I found myself back under the late-night lights of Gino's. I ordered a steak with whiz and onions and handed over a 10 for the pleasure. The girl at the counter was younger than me, slouched against the window in a tank top and Phillies cap. Our Lady of Guadalupe was tattooed big and bright on her right arm from elbow to shoulder. An aurora of stylized red fire framed the Virgin, her cool blue cloak spangled with 100 pinprick stars. Her eyes were downcast, away from the world, as though to look upon it would bring her a sorrow greater than all that she had already endured. "Yo," I asked the girl, "do you speak Spanish?" "Not on the clock," she said. "Do people ever speak Spanish to you?" She snorted and handed me my order. "Napkins and condiments to your left." I took the sandwich across the street and stood against the fence of Capitolo Playground, where the young men of Passyunk Square played basketball in the evenings. The courts were empty. I jammed the sandwich into my mouth, feeling bits of steak and onion leaping out the back of the roll, splattering wetly on the sidewalk by my feet. I was ravenous. I'd never been so hungry. The heat inside my gut was the heat of life, a heat that demanded to be fed, to burn, to spread as far and wide as it could before death came and snuffed it out. I hated death. Death was all I hated. I would flee from it forever. I would do whatever I needed to keep it far away from me. Halfway through, I started to feel full. I swaddled the remainder of the steak in its logo-checkered wrapper, snug as a cocoon. As I walked into the night, I wondered if it was possible to find a motivation other than hate. Soon I stood again in the middle of 13th Street, and I pitched the wrapped, half-eaten sandwich up through the second-story window where 2 hours before I had seen Kathy's darkened face. I made it on the first try. The cheesesteak was soundless as it sailed through the air, floating like a snowball into her room, among her books and clothes and furniture. As I turned and ran, I imagined that I heard it smack against some surface, knock some vulnerable object clattering to the floor. I knew that no one would chase me as I tore up 13th Street. I ran simply because I could, because my legs still worked and it felt good to move them. I knew that the sun would rise before too long, and that I would sense that I'd had a part in its rising. And I knew that Kathy Tomlinson would wake and find half a cheesesteak lying like a dead pigeon on her floor, next to a shattered flower vase or water glass, and that she would know instantly who had thrown it there. Perhaps Kathy would notice that it wore a Gino's wrapper, and to her that would signify a certain type of vandal, one who might or might not fit with her conception of me. She would try to remember, was the Dennis Monk she knew a Gino's man? Was he a Pat's man, or a Jim's man, or a Tony Luke's man? Was he the sort of man who believed that we had no choice at all? She would think of me, of all of me, and in her memory I would live. Thanks.
So Michael said he would answer some questions if folks have them. So any questions for our author? And TV style, here you go.
My only question is, I guess, like, how did you find your writing style? Like the descriptives and everything.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't really know if I have a good answer. I think, when you first start out writing, you kind of find the writers that you like, and you're still very like malleable, and I think the kind of the stuff that you read influences you a lot. And so for a long time, you're kind of just writing stories. Like I liked Dennis Johnson a lot. I liked Sherman Alexie, Junot Diaz. And so I wrote like a lot of stories that kind of felt like sort of knockoffs of them, And then eventually, you kind of just like, as it starts to feel more natural, it's like you develop your muscles, and then an original voice kind of emerges. And there's like echoes of the stuff that you like are still in there, but you also have kind of like struck on, I think it's crazy, like every single person kind of has their own like weird, unique voice that they, it's just sort of a matter of tapping into it. But yeah, and it just, it takes time and writing a lot of stuff. Yeah.
Other questions?
Okay, so 2 questions. Do you think you discovered yourself more when you're writing this story? That's the first question.
Sorry, say that one more time?
Do you think you discovered more about yourself when you wrote the story? Like, do you think the experiences of writing it kind of like changed how you view things, or do you think it's or was it more just a story?
Oh, definitely.
In what ways?
Well, I think writing in general is like they always say writing is thinking, like we write in order to think something through. So you should never really like know too much about, like it's not like I have an opinion, I'm gonna like express that opinion through prose. It's more like I have a question and I'm gonna write my way to the answer of that question.
And the second question was, the story was very vivid. Like, how much was it based off of your personal experiences in life?
It's funny. It's sort of an amalgamation, I would say, of like at one point I was sitting in a cheesesteak shop, and a friend of mine was telling me that story about the Amish guy, and that was, I guess, sort of the beginning of this story. But then you bring in like other moments from other nights, other like interactions you've had or you've heard of. And the weird thing is like, because there a lot of the stories in this book are kind of like have formed like that, where there's like a little of me in there, but there's a little of other people and some things that are made up. But the writing process almost like comes to replace your own memory of whatever the inspiring event is, to the point where like I feel like I've lost a lot of like I can no longer really like articulate the original events in some cases. It's kind of like, because you just spend so much time working on a story that it kind of like it imprints itself in your brain and kind of becomes like the real version of the thing. But yeah, that's a good question. Yeah.
I just have this quick question, and then I have to run to the bathroom real quick, so don't think I'm leaving. But how did you go about choosing like the cover of your story?
Ooh, the cover, that's interesting. So when you publish a book, I didn't realize this until I went through this process. You don't really get to pick your cover. Your cover and your title, which you would think are like the 2 most important things, because those are the only things that most people who interact with the book ever get to see. Those are both things that you like you can like veto, but not necessarily like decide, So this wasn't the original title, and with the cover especially, it took a long time to get like a cover that I liked, to the extent that I think I was starting to annoy my publisher, because they sent like 3 or 4 rounds of like 5 or 6 ideas each, and I kept being like, none of these fit the book, because the person designing the book often like they don't read the book. You kind of give them like a summary of the book and like some like visual like motifs from the novel, and I was like, I don't want any like bar stuff. I don't want glassware. I don't want beer labels. I don't want bar stools. And that's what they kept giving me. Like everything was like very like drinking culture stuff. So when they finally, the cover now is it's the Philadelphia skyline, and then in the foreground is this like there's a car parked at an expired parking meter, and it's like in the middle of the desert, which I don't know if like it's the cover gets weirder the longer that you look at it, but there's lots of it's like there's lots of like symbolism in it that I enjoy, but it took a long time to get there. Yeah.
I have two follow-up questions then. So you said that was not your first title, so of course now I want to know what the first title was that they changed.
I wanted to call it New Poets, which is there's a chapter in the book called New Poets that was published as a standalone story in Harper's, and that's the story the story was well received, and that was the story that led to me getting the book deal. And so I think kind of for like superstitious reasons almost, I was like, let's just call it New Poets. And my editor was cool with that, but her boss was like, you can't call a novel New Poets because people will think it's a poetry anthology. And I was like, oh yeah, I guess that makes sense.
All right, my second question is, because the book is out in the United Kingdom, in Great Britain, and that one has a different cover, which has somebody's pouring a glass of beer for someone, right?
Yeah.
So did you just lose that fight?
That's so this was also a thing I didn't realize. So when you sell the rights to have your book published, those are called like the North American rights, and that's your book as it will appear in the U.S. and in Canada. And then you can also sell the English world rights, which is if the book gets published in the UK and like Australia and Ireland and the rest of the English-speaking world. But that's like a completely separate deal, and they have nothing to do with each other. So like in the UK, the book is published by Penguin, and Penguin also exists in America, but in America it's not published by Penguin. It's published by a press called Astor House. And in the UK, when they're publishing an American author, they pretty much just like they just take the edited manuscript when it's done, and then they just kind of do everything without your input, really. So I had no say in that cover, which I think is a fine cover. Although my parents both really hate it, and like kind of every time I talk to them, they like find a way to tell me how much they hate the UK cover, which is they could stop telling me that, but yeah, everything is they have like a similar but distinct literary culture over there, so they have like different ideas about like over there. I think they were trying to emphasize the sort of humor and chattiness of the book, and so they wanted the cover to be like a little more approachable. Whereas I think in the U.S., my editor was like really trying to push like this is like serious, thoughtful literature, so it has like a little more of a serious cover. Yeah.
All right. So I have two questions. The first one is regarding like it comes with the cover, but it's about the setting. So like when you were mentioning about Philly, so we can relate to Philly, but if it was set in a different city where we haven't been to, so how do you make that like to readers? Like do you put in more of the imagery or like the shift between the city and the suburbs? So how do you bring it into the play, like about the setting?
Yeah, that's a good question. The place has always like I care a lot about place when I'm writing, and a lot of the books that I like are very like sort of place centered. Like my favorite genre of book is like a linked story collection set in a specific city that really like captures the vibe of that city. Like Lost in the City by Edward P. Jones is like very much like Washington D.C., you know, or like Train Spotting by Irvin Welsh is like, you learn so much about the city of Edinburgh, which I've still never been to. Like Edinburgh is still like completely shaped for me by that book. So I wanted a book like that. And there are a lot of Philadelphia books now. There were fewer Philadelphia books when I started writing, and certainly when I was like coming up as a writer, it felt like a very ignored city. But for me, it was just like every story that I wrote, I had to figure out before I wrote it where it was, like what like. So for all these stories, it's like I know what block the house is on. Even if it's like a fictional house, it's like, okay, it's on this block. These are the cross streets. These are like if he was going to go to a store or a restaurant or a bar, it would be this, like this is the closest one. And just really like walking him through the city, like sometimes doing the research in person, but honestly just using like Google Maps a lot, like the street view. And then like place can kind of inform the plot in interesting ways. Like in that story, there's like the famous intersection where Pat's and Gino's are like across the street from each other, but there's also like Ray's birthday bars up the street, and like that mural that is in the opening thing the book takes place in 2015. I don't know if I make that clear enough, but in 2015 there was a beer garden. There was an empty lot with a beer garden in it, and there was this old mural with all the like the 1960s like pop stars from South Philadelphia. There were all these Italian American pop stars, and there was a big mural of them. And now there's a building in that lot, and the mural's gone. But it was kind of just like, okay, like if I'm going to write a story in this neighborhood, like what is the character seeing? What is he interacting with? And then like those things can like influence the plot. They can inform like the kind of the recurring motifs of the story. And then the texture of the city kind of like starts to just organically kind of appears in the story. Than if you were just like, oh, it's just like Chicago, but I don't, vaguely Chicago, But yeah.
And the next question is, did the writing process help you in your healing journey of it? Like, does it help the healing process? Like, I know like the writing is itself a healing journey, but I want to hear it from you.
Yeah. It did and it didn't. I think I thought that it would. I wanted it to. Like I feel like when I first got sober, I was writing a lot about my addiction and my sobriety and stuff, and it's therapeutic up to an extent, but like eventually I went to therapy, and that was like really helpful. And then I was like, oh yeah, you can't just write fiction to like solve your deep-seated, emotional issues. But it was it definitely gave me a voice. I mean, that's what sort of the beauty of creative writing is. It's like you can finally like tell your story and put your emotions on paper, and it doesn't heal you, but there's still something extremely cathartic about it and worthwhile about it. But also it's like it's good to go to therapy if something bad happens.
Well, I think those are great words to end on. It's cathartic, but it's also good to go to therapy.
Yeah.
I want to thank Michael for such a beautiful reading. And if you want to buy one of his books, they're in the back. He'll be sitting up front where if you have more questions, you can obviously ask them, or he'll be happy to sign books.